Thank you, Jeff. I apologize for my voice. I developed laryngitis this morning. Of course, it would happen on this day. But I'll talk somewhat softly. If you have trouble hearing, please raise your hand. Whenever I get a chance to teach or talk to philosophers or economists, I get excited. Because most of the groups I talk with these days are bioethicists. I'm an applied philosopher. I turned toward bioethics about 40 years ago. After I turned toward that, I got interested in health economics for ethical reasons. And that led to the work with Jeff and Eric Nord and some others. I make no claim to know what I'm doing in economics, although I have to know a little bit to write some of the things I do. So some of the connections with the economics here, I will leave those almost entirely to you to see. But I found that economists are closer to philosophers almost always in really paying attention to concepts, getting straight what a concept means. A lot of disciplines do it well. Some don't do it very well. So a conceptual inquiry like what I'm doing today, I think will not seem too strange for you, but it will be more philosophical. The relevance to philosophy is, I think, quite clear. Namely, how would we measure the subjective value of life if what I say about our conceptual structure for that notion is as stubbornly ambiguous as I will claim it is. So there's a tremendous challenge here, ultimately, I think, to health economics and its measurement methods. If subjective value of life is one of the things it's getting at in health benefit, which is it's close to the individual utility notion of the value of life. Now, what do I take the subjective value of life outline, or at least in, why do I get interested in this subject? The quick phrase definition of the subjective value of life is that it's the value of life to the person whose life it is. Not necessarily for the person, but to the person. It's endemic in the outlook of conscious and self-conscious beings, and not all beings can have a subjective value of life, but conscious and certainly self-conscious beings do. That is, they put value on their own lives. While not the only value of life, there are many different values, dimensions of the value of life. The subjective value of life is morally and socially central. Loss of it is a fundamental reason death is bad. I think we probe people on that. We will find that you not only think the loss of yours, the value you put on life, the value of your life to you, the loss of that by a death would be bad to you. You also think that that loss to me, my subjective value of my life, is also bad to me. We agree with those characterizations across the board about what is bad to individuals. And there's also part, at least in the United States, of social and political culture. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is part of the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at other writings about life, they had a conception of what life meant to the person who had the pursuit of happiness. That's a subjective notion of the value of life. My focus is on none of the really political or moral questions here, however. My reason for taking up the topic is that it's a subjective value of life is an important topic, I think. But my focus here is simply on what it is. And when I started making this inquiry 3 years ago, I thought I knew what it was. And after probing a bit, spurred by one particular philosopher who I read, I mentioned in a minute, I came to some disturbing conclusions that I wasn't sure we could clarify sufficiently to ever measure it, what the subjective value of life is. So, onward. I will talk about the substance of this notion, but I will also initially just say what the conceptual outline of it. Philosophers do this distinction all the time between the concept of something and the substance within that the concept refers to. But the concept of the value of life, subjective value of life, is, first of all, it's the subjective value of life, the value of life to the person whose life it is, characteristic of all self-conscious beings, I would claim. Secondly, it's the value of life. It's not the value of something in life. It's not the value of the quality of life. It's the value of life itself. Now, what do we mean by life itself? I say it's life compared to death, or life compared to non-existence. Now, you could compare it not with death, but with never having existed. But there's no being. If you never existed, you can't. You can imagine your own non-existence, but the subjective value of that non-existence doesn't have a subject to have it. So I think the only subjective value of life we have is what the comparison with death, with the non-existence, the form of non-existence we call death. The subjective value of life is directly related to the badness of death. I think that's just part of it conceptually. It's the value to the person who may die of what she would lose in death. We might then note right away that there's another concept here besides the subjective value of life that's perhaps a mirror image of it. It's the subjective badness of death. But you almost never hear philosophers or ethicists talking about that. Substantive components. I will claim 3 substantive components. There's an all of life aspect, the subjective value of all our time in life, or we might call the time segments of life. How to structure the segments is another whole issue, but I'll just refer to it as time in life. Colloquially, people talk about time in life. Ethicists often will have coined a term, the comparative life account of the value of life. Your life is 40 years that you have in front of you. If you live, my life is only 10 years, say, in front of me if I live. The comparative rest of our lives is 10 years for me and 40 years for you, let us say. That's the all of life, or all of remaining life, or if I'm looking back at my whole life and adding the future life to it's all of my whole life. It's close to the individual utility value of life. Again, this is subjective because each of all this time in life is valued by the person whose life it is. That's what makes it subjective. But it's still a sort of global account within that life. But secondly, I'll argue, and this is a tribute to Jeff McMahon and David deGrazia, 2 philosophers who filled out this notion, that there's something called time relative interest in life. I'll explain that later in some detail. A newborn infant's time relative interest in its likely 80-year life, assuming that's what the likely life is, compared to the all of life or time in life value of its life. Now that all of life value is the value of those 80 years to that person, to that individual, as it goes through those 80 years. But the time relative interest of a newborn in its future 80 years is very, very little, because at that time of infancy, although it may have 80 years in front of it, it doesn't put any subjective value. There's no value to it as an infant of those 80 years. There may be value to some other aspects of its current existence to it. But thirdly, I'll claim that there are important reference point effects. For example, in a life with disability, even though a person disabled would give up some life in order to cure their disability, let us say. That's the time trade-off method of comparing, of putting the value of health improvements and life extension on the same scale. But even if that's true, compared to death, that person with a disability puts, I would argue, virtually as high a value on their life compared to not being alive at all anymore as any non-disabled person does. That's because their reference point is different than my reference point. Reference points also affect our view of the value of a particular length of life at the end of life. We have good empirical evidence that people put a premium on life at the end of life, not just because they're romantic or indulgent or sentimental, whatever. It's because they really do. The reference point has changed. So a month of life means a lot more to a person who's only got a month of life left at most than it does to a person who's got 36 months of life or 187 or whatever, and you're tacking on just 1 month on top of those other 186. Now, the all of life aspect, if we probe it a little more, it's for the total duration of the prospective life. We usually think of it ahead of time. It's an aggregate of the subjective value, because we're still talking about the subjective value of life. We're not just talking about years. We're talking about the subjective value of those years and that time in life to the person whose life it is. It's an aggregate of the subjective value of all the segments. The value of each segment may be adjusted or discounted for diminished quality. That's part of the subjective value. But for any such quality adjustment, I would argue, only judgments made by the person whose life it is may be used in order for the whole adjustment business to be consistent with the notion of subjective value of life. Some of these claims are a little debatable. I'll just plow through them. Sure.
As you've been talking about this, thinking about my subjective value of my life, and that a lot of the value I put in my life is the value that my children would gain from me being alive compared to me being dead. And how does that fit in at all?
Oh, absolutely.
So that comes in this aspect.
But it's not the value to your children. It's the value to your children to you. The value of that to you. Yeah. Yeah, all that's part of your subjective value. You may strongly want to get to your next grandchild's birth, partly because of that investment in your child. Let's suppose it's the first child of your child. I've known people in exactly this situation. They so much want to get to the birth of that first child of their daughter. And it's not, and that, the reason they want to is because they know that that is going to be so important to their daughter. And they value that value. So yeah, these can be sort of values of values.
But it's also then the value of a stream of outcomes well past your death.
It could very easily be, because those can be affected by your life too. Yeah, and then we get into the whole business of posthumous. Posthumous benefits to the person are, I think, real. I'm not so sure they're subjective, except that during the life they are subjective. I think you have to be conscious in order to have subjective value. But that's, yeah, you're probing a very, I mean, philosophers have written books practically on some of these temporal quandaries. Sure.
We end up in a situation of double counting. So if I value my being alive because I value it for my kids, but then my kids also value it. Are we double counting, or are they both legitimate values?
Both legitimate values. You're important to your kids and you're important to yourself. That's part of the richness of life.
But I'm just thinking of, sorry, so my reference point is, I'm thinking of double counting. And there's lots of different, you can get yourself into lots of little rabbit holes almost about what is it double counting when it comes to altruism, but you don't face the same analogous problem here.
It's an excellent question. I frankly haven't thought about the double counting within subjective value because I think it's less of a threat. It's a threat in social evaluation because double counting seems, on the surface at least, to be unfair. One person counts for two. Now, in subjective value, I'm not sure. Darn, you added another chapter I have to write in the book. Let's exchange email addresses afterward. Now, problems for the all of life view component as a complete view of the subjective value of life. This is Jeff McMahon's counterexample. I think it's rather definitive. If we just count the all of life component, then the loss when a fetus or an infant dies is, let us say, 80 years. Now that 80 years to the fetus and infant will, in the course of it, have subjective value to it. So it's subjective value. Compare that to the loss when a 20-year-old dies. The 20-year-old's death is a lesser loss. It's a smaller loss. Only 80 years, say, instead, 60 years instead of 80. But he just says intuitively, to the person who dies, how could we say the loss of life to a fetus is greater than the loss to the 20-year-old who dies? And therefore, he puts in a separate additional factor, time relative interest. We'll get to that. There are many examples of this particular problem that relying only on the all of life view for subjective value gets you into. The second problem, B here, is the loss when an 80-year-old dies compared to the loss when a 20-year-old dies. Both would otherwise live to 85, let us assume. The ratio of loss would, according to the all of life view, be 5, the loss to the 80-year-old, to 65, the loss to the 20-year-old. But surely the loss to the 80-year-old is not that small as a proportion to the loss to the 20-year-old. This is not as secure an intuition as the one in A, the one about the fetus or the infant. Now, none of this claim about the fetus compared to the 20-year-old is a moral conclusion about what's right and wrong to do to the fetus. This is only an observation about what is the value of life to the fetus. Or to the infant. Now, this is where time relative interest comes in. To solve this problem, McMahon suggests, you have to add time relative interest. At any point in time, psychological relationships connect the current self with later experiences. Similarity, anticipation. When we get to the anticipated time, you have memory connecting back to the current present time, et cetera, et cetera. All these psychological interrelationships, intrapersonal psychological relationships. Those relationships enable a being to have rational egoistic concern for its later life. Without those relationships, you can't have rational egoistic concern. You can't have egoistic concern of any sort, in fact. It's based on the subjective value to us now of our future at this time. It's a function of the strength of those psychological relationships and of our current attitudes toward later life. In late fetus or infancy, time relative interest in life is very low. Later, it's much higher. And it becomes low again in severe dementia, for example. Adding time relative interest into the picture resolves problem A, that we previously noted, the fetus versus the 20-year-old. Additionally, intuitively, in death, the being who incurs the loss is not the being at a future time. That being is not yet in existence. The person who incurs the loss is the person at the time of the loss. This is another reason why McMahon says we have to get TRI into this picture. TRI does not have to be the only element in what is lost. You may still have an all-of-life component. Note, though time relative interest is required to discern the harm or loss to a person dying at a particular time, the wrongness of killing may not be based directly on harm. McMahon, in fact, writes a whole book on how it's not. But then the wrongness of killing or not killing may not be based only on the all-of-life value, subjective value of life either. Subjective value of life is not time relative interest exclusively. People are forward-thinking enough that they realize that the value of life to them in future time is not likely captured by just their current time relative interest, so an ALL component is needed also. We know we can't appreciate everything about our future, so we're going to defer somewhat to that unknown future and its subjective value to us then. We'll say that's the value, part of the value of our life. So it's never just time relative interest. From the vantage point of the current moment, the all-of-life element may seem objective or external, but it itself is subjective if it is thoroughly the value of its segments to the person whose life they comprise. Even McMahon then says subjective value of life is, and subjective value of badness of death in the mirror image, is both the time relative interest the person has in their life at a particular point in time and the all-of-life element. Then you get reference points effect. I've already referred to those, plenty in disability and chronic illness, end-of-life premium, and a more debatable one, I'll just whip through these very fast, short lives compared to long. I thought about this when my late wife died at the age of 65, at a time when my life expectancy was expected to be 80. And I and her children, I had to think about, what is the value of Susan's life? Well, to her, I said. And we sort of all unanimously agreed that the value to her of her 65-year-old life, if that was all she could have, is as great as the value of any of our lives to ourselves. So the value of a short life to the person whose life it is can be as long as the value of a longer life to the person whose longer life it is, even though the person with the short life would very much want a longer life. Now, just what is time relative interest? Is it forward-looking or backward-looking? I'll ignore this for a moment because we've got more important things to do. Is time relative interest at work within the all-of-life component? Are the subjective values of the temporal segments that get aggregated into all of life also time relative interest? Doesn't all subjective value have to emerge from a temporal perspective? If it's to a person, it's to a person at a point in time. No. That's part of subjectivity. No. Thus, maybe all of life element is just TRA all the way down, we might say. But even if it is, the all of life part of subjective value of life as an aggregate is still not an evaluation made from one point in time. The AOL part is therefore not itself a time relative interest, even if it were an aggregate of entirely time relative interests in life. Now, that's a logical point, probably, but not terribly significant substantively. But now here's the big problem. None of these questions. Is TRI really at work within AOL? And is AOL really just TRI all the way down? I think that's a not terribly difficult or disturbing question. It may not be difficult to resolve. And even if it were, it may not be disturbing. But here's the difficult one. The relationship between time relative interest and all of life components in comprising subjective value. The person who initially came up with time relative interest, McMahon, and a fellow articulator, David DeGrazia, mentioned both of these ways of construing the relationship of time relative interest to the all of life element. One is to see it as a discounting factor. Suppose the time relative interest at an early time, say infancy, is, or no, let's say 10 years old. The 10-year-old's conception of its future life is much more present oriented, doesn't care about the future nearly as much, even though children really do care about the future. They probably don't care about the future as much as a 30-year-old does, say. Suppose it's 0.5 compared to a maximum of 0.1. And then all of life, put value, but immediately you have questions of what are the proportional relationships here? But anyway, suppose it's 1. You would then discount that 1 by 0.5, and the subjective value of your life at that point in time, T1, were you to die at T1, what would be lost is 0.5. TRI in infancy, let us suppose, is 1/100th. And again, multiplied by 1. The subjective value of life then at infancy for the infant would be 0.01. A different view is to see time relative interest as additive to all of life component. So you add 0.01 to 1, and you get 1.01 subjective value of life for the infant. Suppose the TRI of a 10-year-old is 0.5, or to somebody later perhaps, even 0.9. You add that to 1, and you get 1.5, say for the 20-year-old, or maybe it's 1.9. The numbers are not so important here. The question then is, in the additive version, you brought TRI into the picture in order to solve the counterintuitive claim that what an infant loses if it dies is greater than what a 20-year-old loses if it dies in subjective value. Now, if the ratio is 1.01 to 1.5, let's say, or 1.01 to 1.9, is that a sufficient difference for us to say, yeah, it's more important in terms of loss of value to the people who lose their lives, not for a 20-year-old not to lose her life than for a fetus or an infant not to lose its life. I think it is enough. I don't think you need to claim more than that. Now, all these numerical calculations may be a little misleading, but use them as examples only.
So I suppose you're not going back to the infant. Like I suppose you're saying that the infant doesn't have the ability to assess their life. Therefore, they don't know what they're losing, or
I've been through in very close circumstances, not my child, but close friends. Or in the case of a 20-year-old, somebody I knew very well. I've just had the emotional firsthand experience of the loss of a 20-year-old's life. And also, right, and the loss of an infant's life. And there is no question in my mind that the loss of a 20-year-old's life is in subjective value to the 20-year-old greater. Now, this was not a death that came suddenly when the person didn't know it was coming. This was a death they knew was coming.
That's because the infant is hard to assess what their subjective.
Well, there's a subjective value to all of their life that they might have had, and that's lost in death, to be sure. But the loss to the infant. Now, the psychodynamics in the family and the loved ones here are partly, and I've heard them actually say this, well, thank heavens, little Betsy didn't know what she was losing. I've actually heard that out of the mouth of a parent. It is some small solace. And
so the 20-year-old who died was saying when they were an infant, their value of life was less than when they became 20.
The subjective value, yeah, the subjective value of life to them was, you're right, we've got, but, well, we'll get back to it. Public policy use of subjective value refers to the value of the whole life in part. So, now, let's suppose we side with the additive. There's a strong plea that can be made that in qua subjective value, we should go with the discounting relationship between TRI and AOL. But I think overall, we would want to, if it were up to us about our own lives, we'd claim it's both. Now, there's a more of an argument to be made there, but I'm making a quick psychological appeal there. But let's suppose that the additive view is the stronger of the relationship between TRI and AOL is the correct one. What proportional relationship then holds between them? We still don't know. That's the problem I got into when I was adding 0.01 to 1.0. We still have no clear view of what subjective value of life is. Summary so far. TRI and AOL are both indispensable components of the subjective value of life. Variable reference points affect both. Some method is needed to discern the subjective value of the segments comprising all of our lives. It could be time relative interest, might not have to be. Both discounting and additive models can be defended, but the stronger case, let us suppose, is for the additive model. But we would still need to know the proportional relationship between the two. Yes, at the end of all this, some of subjective value of life structure is clear. It has these three components, I'd claim. But we still confront inherent ambiguity. With no clear view of what it is, how can we measure it? We can measure its separate components, perhaps, but can we measure it? So what then? I'm not just going to throw up my hands and say it's hopeless. Because I think we deal with ambiguity and difficulty and puzzles of this depth and this scope frequently in the things we construct for how to proceed in various intellectual constructions and various policy constructions. One option, I'll mention a second option which may be more appealing. One option is to say that inherent ambiguity, if that's what it is, requires clarity. Strong cases can be made for both TRI and for AOL and for different combinations of them. And I state those cases in the first two bullets, essentially. We do not have to choose between these two. If we just make clear when any estimate of the subjective value of life is being made, what perspective and temporal scope is being employed. So when individual utility values of life, not the quality of life, but life itself, are made, we would just need to clarify what we had looked at in making that estimate. Was time relative interest taken into account or not? That itself would help the whole discipline of comparison and measurement. It's cumbersome though. Wow. Then you have no standardization, perhaps. So another option is to assign different roles for different situations. We'd have to justify that assignment. One situation is at the edges of personal or subjective life. Time relative interest should dominate, let us say, in late stage fetus, newborn, and end stage dementia. To the fetus, there's no sense in which to it, the all of life value much matters. In severe dementia with little capacity to anticipate or remember, all of what is left has little subjective value. Second, in the primary span of life, not only time relative interest, but all of a person's time in life matters. Even a short-sighted 20-year-old can be quickly brought to acknowledge that the longer accumulation of time is significant. If they say, oh, I'm not much concerned about what's going to happen after I'm 40, when you're arguing with them about why they aren't a little more interested in saving and starting an investment fund for their pension plan, the first job they get, et cetera, you've pointed out how the most important factor is whether they start at 20 instead of 30. It's not the interest rate. It's not how much they put in. It just start early. And they say, well, but you can bring them to their senses pretty quickly, usually. Any adult looking back will say it matters. AOL, it is. Neither of these claims can be made for the fetus or the severely demented. That's why we might have a different standard way of measuring subjective value of life in the primary spans of life, whether that's from 5 to 80 or whether it's from 2 to mid dementia, or exactly what. It would be, just call it the primary span of life. And then I think for public policy and certainly for health economics, you'd have to speak to the situation of doing an aggregate subjective value of life in a population. That's a different context in which we use subjective value of life. And there we might, I think, argue convincingly that all of life components should count greatly, though I would also argue not exclusively. Aggregation, after all, is inherently impersonal. The aggregation in an aggregate subjective value in a population. Why shouldn't the somewhat impersonal, less than purely subjective all of life component of an individual's subjective value of life be included in a population aggregate? This isn't a knockdown, this isn't a dunk shot argument, but it's sort of an argument of affinity. But should it dominate? Time relative interest is still needed, or the death of a newborn would count as a greater loss in the population aggregate than the death of a 20-year-old. I don't think it should count as more than the death of a 20-year-old. If we cure diseases that otherwise kill 20-year-olds, have we done less than if we cure diseases that kill infants? I don't think so, because I think TRI is an important part of the subjective value of life. If we're talking about minimizing the badness of death to the people whose life is lost in death.
Following that argument, then you would say, oh, well, I'm not going to let the 20-year-old is going to die. I should have just killed them in. Because then they would have had a lower loss. So it's kind of like the opposite, right? So
actually, that's one of the examples that Ulla Norheim is a physician health economist in Norway, whose work you probably know, some of you know, who has focused on that among 2 or 3 other key examples in a paper that I've seen a draft of. And I think there's some confusions in that. You're comparing, what precisely was the example again?
So I suppose someone's going to die at 20, then I would lose less by killing them before they even reach 20. I'm not even going to let them reach 20 because they're going to die. So kill them off.
The time relative interest they have in living when they're 20 is so great, and therefore the loss of their death, constituted by their death at 20, is such a great loss to them, greater than the loss to the infant. Yes, but that ignores the value of the 20 years to them. And the subjective value of life, that is the value of life to them, is not just their time relative interest in life. I would argue it's also the all of life component. It's both. And I can get out of your counterexample by that. But secondly, just because the subjective value of life, the value that it actually is, let us say, and the subjective, let's put it the other way. Suppose the subjective badness of death is worse to the 20-year-old than it is to the infant. That does not mean that morally it's permissible to kill the infant.
Or not say, right? Just not give them intervention that would keep them alive longer.
No, it's not concluding that. Again, my inquiry here is just what is the subjective value of life? Not, and what is the loss? It's not whether, because a loss is larger, it's right to prevent that loss before preventing another loss. I don't think the wrongness and rightness of killing or the wrongness and rightness of not saving is a direct function of what is lost in not saving or in killing. But that's another long philosophical discussion, an argument. If you want the book length treatment of that claim, that it's not a function of just the loss in death, that is, the morality of killing and not saving is not a direct function of the loss in death. McMahon's whole book, The Ethics of Killing, is basically about that. It's complicated stuff. I mean, he's a brilliant, sophisticated in his complexities of his perceptions, philosopher. But I think when you can cut through all the convoluted, detailed parts, he's really onto something in that claim. Yes? Very good. Very, very good question. I had 3 or 4 slides on that in the first draft of this. I didn't. I finally said it's going to be too long. You know. Usually, when a person says the time relative interest I have in my life right now, that is, what I value my life to be, compared to dying now, is virtually nothing. I'm depressed. I don't think I have a future. That future life means nothing to me. Okay if I die. We say, no, there still is value there. And usually we're correct. We get them past the depression, and there is this big value. Now, their time relative interest at that point may be very low or non-existent, but still they have this value to the rest, to their life, the AOL value, all of life value. That's there, that's part of the subjective value. We, of course, might be wrong. We get them to the later life, and they're still depressed. And so we have these cases. It's a big subject now in the Netherlands. My wife, Bonnie Steinbach, just published an article, a lengthy article on this in the Hastings Center report, the so-called treatment-resistant depression cases where people want to be euthanized. Really being talked about. The treatment-resistant depression cases are you can't just say, well, the person's depressed, they'll get over it, because you've tried for a decade to treat them and they're still depressed and they still say, my life isn't worth living. I'm in pain every day. not physical pain. Those cases are not so, it's not so easy to say the depression, because it's a subjective factor, is not going to count in any decisions they're allowed to make.
I'm struggling to understand the difference between someone, say, who's severely temporarily, or even a more extreme example, and they're in a coma temporarily, and their current subjective, they don't have faith in it because they're not able to, cognitively. But then you say that they do have a value because they're going to get better in the future, and then they'll know they've got value. But then for a newborn, you say they've got no value because they're
No.
or much lower value. I don't understand those two comparisons.
The newborn, it's an important comparison to reckon with. But I would never want to say, I don't think anybody, including even McMahon, who's the strongest defender of TRI, would say that the value to the newborn is, of the subjective value of their life, is virtually zero.
Why should we heavily discount the newborn subjective value of life, but we shouldn't heavily discount it?
Well, I would argue you shouldn't discount it. We should. The relationship of AOL to TRI is an additive function, not a discounting function.
Discount whether that comes with an additive function or
it's some, moderate discounting.
From depression or having someone being in a coma, we should also have a big negative on their life, right?
Well,
is it the same thing?
We have to separate what is justified to do by not saving them or saving them is one question. The rightness or wrongness of that. A different question is what is actually lost if they die. And one of the reasons we wouldn't want to say it's okay to not to save them because they're in a coma is because they had views before they slipped into a coma that said, if you can get me out of a coma, damn it, keep me alive. And so we'd be not respecting them as whole persons, people who had these views before. So the moral question about what to do, save them or not save them when they're in a coma, is much more complex than just the question, what is the subjective value of life that they've lost if they die now?
That's the question I'm asking. So what's their subjective value of life currently, that person in the coma?
Their TRI is zero. And their AOL, depending on what life they have in front of them, could be huge. Well, that is in fact the real quandary. When we have a person who we think we probably can't pull out of a coma, maybe it isn't wrong at all not to save them.
But they've got like some measure of life expectancy. But that's in the absence of a whole lot of other things that could happen. I mean, you could have an accident in 5 years' time and be dead.
Well, sure, we have to make reasonable estimates here.
This is all about subjective, though. Why are we could say the same for a newborn, right? We could have estimates about what life they're going to be and put a value on that. But I thought the argument for a newborn was that TRI, that their ability to be subjective is very limited. So therefore, we have a lower value of life for them. So let's feel like it's applying the same reason to an older life that's got a similarly diminished ability to be subjective.
Well, first of all, I do think the total subjective value of life of a person who's now in a coma, that is the total subjective value of the life at stake. Remember, we're always sort of interested in the life at stake, not the past life. It is lower when a person's in a coma because the TRI is zero. It still may not be all that much lower, but that's because in an additive function, the dominant weight still may go to the all of life component.
If that's the case, then the newborn should be very valuable.
Yes, I think a newborn is close, the life of a newborn to itself is close to, is not all that far away from the value of a 20-year-old's life to it. Its TRI is hugely different in the two cases. but not its overall subjective value.
Which one's higher?
But which one's higher?
Because one's gonna make-
We'd have to straighten out the additive proportional relationship, and I'm claiming that's how do we possibly do that? That's the inherent ambiguity I'm seeing in the whole notion of the subjective value of life. If it's got to have TRI and AOL in it, but we don't know the additive proportions, how can we ever say what the total is? What I should really be willing to say after my claim that there's this inherent ambiguity because of the absence of agreement on a proportional relationship between the TRI and AOL, I should say, I don't know what the value is. But of course, I have a tendency to think that's a cop-out. We can't know roughly. It's just that, but on the other hand, I really do think there's an inherent ambiguity here. And when it comes to guiding it, then that's the huge challenge for what we measure. If we don't know what we're measuring, how can we measure it?
Well, the whole idea of value of life is the basis for our calculations. And maybe simplifying it, it seems to me that what you're trying to do is take a subjective value, intrinsically subjective, and making it in some sense external, so that others are able to add it up and use it. Now, if that's the case, I think I'd be in your camp believing it's intrinsically impossible. Now, we can never be inside another person, just in the same way that we don't know what the subjective value of an animal is, just as we may not know what the subjective value of a robot is. So the question is this a good basis for actually doing our calculation?
Well,
we can still say a person's subjective value, they are personally prepared to trade length
sure.
and quality, and we can respect that
Yep.
individual's wish.
Yep.
And in interpersonal comparisons, we have to have some sort of social contract on which we agree on the rules of this, and we can actually, some of your intuitions can be put in at the aggregate level. They're trying to actually get something from inside each individual.
Okay. But then you have to give up on individual utility. Individual utility is a subjective notion. The individual utility of life, and here I'm talking about life, the individual utility of life itself is a subjective value of life. Now, if you want to, yes, in fact, you and I have encountered this in economics. And
You cannot just do it as a Richmond did it, saying you should point to one. That's the social contract in which you're saying in order to make this practical, give each.
No, but wait a minute, that itself would never work, because that would make the value of life left for a 99-year-old equal to who's in severe dementia the same as the value of life left for a 2-year-old or a 20-year-old. So first of all, then we'd break it down and we'd say, well, it's the year of life, not the life. But wait a minute, the value of life to a person whose life it is, which I think is morally important. If we don't save people because of the value of life to them, then we're saving them not out of respect for them, but only as instruments to the benefit of others or whatever. So morally, I think we've got to keep our eye on this subjective value of life, or we're missing why it's so important not to save people.
I think Bentham's original idea was that you have pleasure pain, and so you could sort of adjust the level of utility for anybody. So he didn't talk about equality, but he effectively had equality, but it was limited to one. And sure, as the person's quality of life varied, so the utility varied. That left the possibility of interpersonal comparison. So Bentham's idea was that in fact you had this contract which actually made this interpersonal comparison. It's only when you do away with that and you say there's an open-ended subjective value of life that we're got to get it external from every person.
Well, Bentham didn't. But Bentham had to have some assumption like a year of life is a year of life is a year of life, and they're all equal to every individual. And he gets then he would say the the remaining value of life for an 80-year-old is less than the remaining value of life for a 20-year-old. But he's got to make some assumption about years of life or something that does not make the loss of life, if a person loses life, the same for everybody.
Unfortunately, some scheme of laws that allow pleasure pain, this idea of utility, and you can vary from
Yeah, okay.
pleasure pain zero.
I should back. Yeah. I should back off because I'm not a Bentham scholar, and you probably know a lot more about Bentham than I do.
It's not clear to me that we want to be using individual subjective values of their own life.
Well, I think there's a strong claim here. With all these difficulties, still use subjective value of life in public policy about life saving and death prevention? I would say yes. Or at least I think there's a strong tradition in parts of our society to say yes, and philosophically to say yes. In the tradition of non-paternalism, a la Mill, John Stuart Mill, a primary concern of society should be to increase the good of all individuals. What is good for individuals ultimately rests on what they judge to be in their benefit. It may be distorted and interrupted along the way, but ultimately, surf sailing is valuable to me, not because of what you or anybody or any doctor who works in an emergency room and sees accidents or anything says about surf sailing. It's what I say about the comparative value of the experience of surf sailing despite the risks. So, and that applies to life, not just to the experience of surf sailing.
Sure, but I guess it comes down to who's actually skilled. And so in public policy that sidesteps any that will certainly be paid, but in a statistical life rather than a
Agreed. I'm not saying that subjective value of life should dominate everything in public policy by any means. And also, by the way, in statistical life, there's a subjective element, but that's another matter. Pick that up in prevention. But health and if health and safety policy, when lives are at stake, is not based in part, at least, on subjective value of life of all the individuals affected, then I think we've lost a really important part of the respect for individuals that should be part of the whole modus vivendi for saving lives. I don't see other, I mean, there's more to it than just maximizing subjective value and minimizing the subjective badness of death, to be sure. But that's got to be part of it, is all I would claim.
But I think so, the very statistical life, the unit of analysis is the individual, and it's their individual preferences. So it's over a small, it's over the probability of death. So it's still maintaining the age of individual, but it's not over their whole life. It's over the probability of the proportion of their life. And then we sum over every.
That's right.
The statistical one unnamed,
That,
not faceless.
right. Once you get into the aggregate for a population, and therefore the more directly the public policy connections, we get a whole set of other complications. But one of the ingredients still motivating any of that, I think, is the notion of the individual utility value of life, which is the subjective value of life, the value of life to the person whose life it is. To take that out entirely is what I object to.
Yeah. You know, I don't disagree with that. I'm just, I guess, where my view would be to allow everybody to have their own subjective value of life, which would obviously be subjective and all different by individuals, and then simply sum those up and go, okay, that's what we're going to pay for life, to save a life in public policy, whether it's a safety intervention or health intervention or transport, etc. It's not clear to me that that's the right decision to use because they're not fitting the bill.
Oh, I don't want to, believe me, I don't want to deny the relevance of that, which is a fairness, brings in a whole bunch of other fairness considerations. yes, the public policy picture is not even dominant. It's certainly not totally focused on subjective value of life and minimizing the subjective badness of death. It's also may not even be dominantly focused on that. But if it excludes it entirely, that's what I object to. But I'm over time here, clearly. I'm glad we had discussion along the way, so I don't feel like that got shortchanged.
Those people who can't answer those questions, you've got plenty of time in your career.
Oh, Jeff, I didn't mean this as an assault on your colleagues. So one of the things.